Okay, moving on to part 3 of migration. I want to talk about types of movement. We have cyclic movement, periodic movement, and migratory movement. Cyclic movement is your everyday movement. Every day you have a cycle where you get up, you go to work, you go to school, you come home. You get up, you go to school, you go to work, you go home. You get up, you go to work, you go to school, you go to a friend's house, you go to the bank, you go home. You have a certain cycle that you follow day in and day out. That's your cyclic movement, your daily cyclic movement. Now, if we took that movement and we drew a boundary with it around it, that is your action space. So your action space is the space within which your cyclic movement occurs. And many times that action space can be fairly small, where you could stay, for instance, in one part of town or a 10 square mile radius for days on end without varying from that. So your cyclic movement is your daily movement, and that daily movement occurs within your action space. Now just say you have your daily cyclic movement, but on the weekends you go someplace else. Maybe on the weekends you go out of town. Maybe you visit family. Maybe at winter break you go somewhere, or spring break you go somewhere. That's periodic movement. So periodic movement simply is movement that occurs periodically. So it's not your normal daily routine, but you're not permanently moving. You're just breaking up that cyclic movement for a short period of time. So the assumption is you're going to come home at some point. Migratory movement is when you've actually moved. So when you've actually packed up your stuff, filled out the change of address form, and you moved someplace else. The intention here is that you're not coming home. Doesn't mean you're never going to move again. Doesn't mean that you won't come home, but it's not something like I'll see you next week type of thing. You're actually permanently, it's considered more of a permanent move. So those are the 3 types of movement. Now there's one particular type of migrant that stands out a little more from all others, and that is a refugee. And there are approximately 15 to 30 million refugees in the world at any one given point in time. Now that may seem like a big difference there, and it is. And I'll explain why that is in a minute. Refugees have 3 characteristics that make them a little different than your typical migrant. The first one is that they generally make their first steps with a more primitive means of transportation. They generally take their first steps with a more primitive means of transportation, meaning they're walking, a boat, maybe riding a bike. Okay. In other words, they're not booking airline tickets and things like that. So their first moves are generally very simple. Secondly, they tend to take with them just what they can carry. So they're not packing up boxes and renting U-Hauls and things like that. They take with them just what they can carry, and everything else stays. Because this is usually done last minute. Thirdly, they tend to not have any official documentation. And this is why we don't know the exact number of how many refugees are out there, because they usually don't have any identification. First of all, this, like I said, this is usually done quickly. There may not be time to get official documentation. Secondly, depending upon why they're leaving, having documentation may not be the best option. If they're leaving because of ethnic unrest, for instance, and their identification will list their ethnicity, that might not be something they want to carry around. So this is why sometimes if you look at refugee camps, there may be a board outside the camp just full of pictures of who's in the camp to see if anyone can identify people. So because of this, so many people are double counted, triple counted, or not counted at all. And that's why we have that big gap of approximately 15 to 30, because there are so many that are unaccounted for. So when we think about refugees, sometimes the idea comes up of how much does the media play a role in our coverage of refugees and what we know about refugees. Because like I said, at any given point in time, there could be 15 to 30 million, if not more, refugees out there, but very few of us know anything about it. There might be 1 or 2, 3 tops major events going on in the world where there are refugees, where we might see footage, where we might actually see the lines of people walking. But very often we don't. We don't hear anything about refugees. So it brings up the question of what role does the media play? And does it lend us to make reasoned decisions about which people we're going to help, which people we're going to address? Should we help? Many times the coverage is strategic, and it can really guide our decisions. And if we had all the civil wars in the world and all the refugee situations in the world laid out in front of us, we may make a different decision versus if we went by just what we saw on television or media coverage. I always give the example, this has nothing to do with refugees, but I always give the example of the famous SPCA commercial that's on, where you have the animals that have the saddest look ever, and then they got Sarah McLachlan playing in the background. And I mean, I saw this commercial so many times that it just wore me down to the point that I just said, just give me the phone, just let me donate, because it really pulls at the heartstrings. Now, is that a bad move? I don't know, but if I looked at every single organization out there that I could possibly donate to, I may or may not have made the right decision. Okay, like I said, not that it was a bad decision, but it was definitely the commercial that kind of pushed me over the hump to decide to make that particular decision. So it makes you think about whether our decisions are actually reasoned decisions or whether they're decisions based on media coverage of that particular event. And then also another thing to consider is, what is our role? And this is going to be another discussion question. And one question that comes up quite often is, should American military personnel be sent overseas to help refugees if it exposes them to danger? And we've seen this time and time again, and it's controversial every time it happens. And it really comes down to what we feel is the role of our troops. And should there be purely humanitarian efforts, or is the role to guard and protect? And what happens when you're in a situation where no matter which way you go, it could turn out bad? For example, in 1993, for those of you that may have seen Black Hawk Down, not 100% accurate portrayal, but it does give us a sense of what happened when there was the issue in Somalia, and we sent troops in, and Americans saw images of U.S. soldiers being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu. Okay. So that wasn't good. So it was, a lot of backlash. Why did we send the troops? Why did we do this? Why did we do that? And then a year later, we have the crisis in Central Africa, a similar situation where we had the Rwanda incident and the conflict between the Hutus and the Tutsis. For those of you that saw Hotel Rwanda, I relate everything to movies if I can, but again, not 100% accurate portrayal. But then we had to decide, do we want to send troops? And we got a lot of criticism for not doing enough for that cause. But we have to also understand that that was in 1994. 1993 was the incident in Mogadishu. So then we had to make that decision a year later. Do we want to get involved? Do we not want to get involved? So it's almost damned if you do, damned if you don't. So it's a very, very difficult decision. So that's one question. to think about. On the other hand, some can say that the U.S. has a clear interest in humanitarian issues because by one estimate, by 2050, 30% of the world's population is in Africa. And would it be in our best interest to support that part of the world or just to write it off? And would it be better to create a more stable society, a more stable political and economic climate in that area? Again, not easy questions to answer. And then we have the question of, should we accept more refugees? What should be our role? Should we accept more? Should we come to the aid? And many will say, just as with the first question, if we are able to help, we should. We should help if we have the means. Others will say that it's not our job to answer the world's 911 call. And when it comes to accepting more refugees, it's a similar issue. And many will say yes, we should accept more refugees. Some will say no. And some might be somewhere in between. Some might say yes, we should accept more refugees, but I don't want them in my city, which happens a lot. This is an issue that comes up a lot in planning. It's an acronym called NIMBY, which means not in my backyard. And planners have to deal with that all the time, where the city has a clear need for something, but nobody wants it near their house. You know, we need to build this, we need a new dump, okay, we need a new power plant, or we need something, but I don't want it in my backyard. Well, it has to be put somewhere. So that's kind of a problem that planners always struggle with, and developers always struggle with. This is an analogy to this type of situation that many will say yes. And then there have been cases when it actually happened, when cities have taken in large numbers of refugees from a certain part of the world, that those people then had issues when it came to job allocation and housing and all of those sorts of issues. So again, difficult questions, not easy questions. There aren't right or wrong answers to any of these questions, but they're very good discussion questions. So I would be very interested to see how the discussion goes and what some of your comments are when this is up on the discussion board. Okay, so this ends the third part of the population / migration PowerPoint.